Support comes from Seattle Restored, revitalizing Seattle neighborhoods with creativity and commerce. Over 95 vacant storefronts have been transformed into vibrant pop-up shops, window art installations, and artist residences. Explore current and past locations at seattlerestored.org.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.
Hey, welcome to Meet Me Here, your weekly guide to arts and culture worth leaving your house for. I'm Jeannie Yandel, and in this bonus episode, I talk with artist and writer Jeremy Collins about his new graphic memoir and his book event here in Seattle, where you can be immersed in a life-sized art journal and some of the best elements of storytelling. In time, people can be like sequoia trees. That's the premise of the new graphic memoir by artist and writer Jeremy Collins. The memoir is called Eventually A Sequoia: Stories of Adventure and the Wisdom of Giants. And yes, actual sequoias, the largest trees on Earth, do show up in the memoir. Jeremy even climbs one. But mostly, this book is about people Jeremy's traveled with over the last decade. People who planted small seeds through their work and their service. Seeds that led to enormous results. Jeremy will be in town on Monday, October 27th to talk about his new book and to bring audience members into his process with an evening of performance art and cinematic visuals, followed by a conversation with Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novelist Tessa Hulls. Time shows up in all kinds of ways in Eventually a Sequoia. I wanted to learn more about that, so I talked with Jeremy before his visit. But first, I had to ask him about the way he decided to start his memoir. Jeremy, I have to start with something you write about in the very first few lines of the introduction to this book. You describe an interaction with a professor who told you that you'd never make a living with your art. Why did you start there?
Man, you know what? I've been waiting for that question. It's a standalone little story that as I was building out the pieces and parts that would come into the book, it just sat to the side. And I thought maybe it'll come in, maybe it won't. But in the end, I reached and grabbed for that little story and brought it to the beginning because it just felt like a point where I was maybe believing that I wouldn't make a living as an artist. And, a young person is full of hope and doubt fighting each other. And to have a professor say that, it was his dark humor, maybe, but he was also being honest. Maybe part of it is just saying, told you so to this professor. And maybe that was his goal all along, is that negative, like football coach style guiding.
I will admit to you that part of why I wanted to ask you that question is because I love a little I told you so moment. One of the other things that really took a hold of my mind in the introduction of your book is the way you describe your experience with time, right now anyway. It doesn't exactly fly. It does feel like it's running out for you in some ways. I think a lot of people feel that way, like what's happening with time, where is it going? I'm wondering if your experiences traveling and documenting and drawing and creating art for this book, you go to Brazil, you go to Nepal, you go to Utah, Northern Alaska, did that change your relationship with time at all, the way you experience time?
I think going into the manuscript, it forced me to look at the timeline and look at the dates. Again, while I'm building up the pieces of the stories, it's like, oh, this was actually 2 weeks when it felt like a month, or perhaps these two experiences were back to back rather than months apart, because I wasn't going on those journeys plotting that it was going to be a book. So it was singular experiences with a purpose of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until my publisher was like, you've got the stories, write the book, that I had to sit down and look at the timeline and go, oh, wow, this was a decade. This was a decade of stories that only in reflection had some sort of thread that tied them all together. And that's where we come in the at the end is like, oh, all these things had a purpose. And I was going through this timeline of an identity shift, of questioning my purpose, of seeking the best use of my skill set. And looking at the timeline, I got to see, oh, here's a decade of progress for me as a writer and an artist, and answering questions on the road.
For listeners who haven't read your book yet, essentially each chapter of the book represents one of those singular journeys you were talking about. We meet individuals that you are working with and that you are in dialogue with and community with in all of these different places around the world. And in the very first chapter of the book, you are in Brazil with Celine Cousteau, the daughter of Jacques Cousteau, the famous explorer. She's a documentarian. And one of the ways you describe yourself is as the village icebreaker when you go into these indigenous villages, which sometimes meant you're pulling out all your art supplies so that the kids in these villages could sit with you and draw alongside you. I bring this scene up because it was a moment for me as a reader where I felt time kind of slowing down. What was time like for you in those moments where you were the icebreaker person, the person who sort of was creating a bridge between the group you were with and these indigenous villages you were visiting in Brazil?
That invitation for that journey came after Celine saw my first memoir, which was Drawn, which is a story of 10 years, oddly enough, of climbing expeditions. So, we have this initiative. We want to get to the top of this mountain or these
Mm-hmm.
large cliffs. Like, we're going with this goal. And what shifted in this invitation from Celine was the goals were somewhat mysterious. Celine invited me to come and create and tell stories visually as a traditional artist while we had a film crew, cameraman, and the sound guy. But I was very extra, I guess you could say. Like, she didn't need me to be there,
Mm,
but she had this artistic vision as a filmmaker that a traditional artist would have some benefit. So, all that to say, me being the icebreaker was not the plan. There was no guidance or us discussing it. It just happened naturally. And when I pull out a pad of paper and drawing material, the kids would magnetize to that experience because I wasn't utilizing our translator. The translator was on camera, and it was, you're asking about the separation of time.
mm,
As you're asking that, I'm realizing none of these journeys did I have access to phone connection. So the phone that I had with me was only for photographs because I wasn't texting or fiddling with social media or reading emails. And so maybe that's that time experience, is that when we step away from constant access to our phones, we go into this time warp of our
mm.
own, of those of us of a certain age. Like, we know what that life was like before we were sucked into the void of the little rectangles we carry with us everywhere.
Right.
And so it was a detachment from the world as we know it, from the timeline as we know it.
I'm glad you brought that up. Our memories of the time before our devices, because in chapter 5, you talk about your memories of being a kid with your brothers
hmm
in
hmm
Missouri, running around in the woods. And I wanted to ask you about the Jeremy tree. What is the Jeremy tree? Can you tell us about it?
The Jeremy tree was planted in the front yard of my grandparents' home when I was born. And it was only in the process of writing that I had this realization of, I climbed that tree when both it and I were strong enough to hold each other. That when it was planted, it wasn't strong enough for me. And I, of course, as a baby, wouldn't be strong enough to climb it, but that we grew together to a point where we could commune in that way. And this led, even though I took that nugget of a story and put it towards the end of the book, it was very much a driving force and thought as I worked through the rest of the book of, where do I go for solitude? Where do I go for safety? And here's this story from my childhood that I don't know that I've ever written about, but because of this process, I tapped into memories from that childhood where a tree became something sacred. A tree became a safe place. And that carries on with me throughout my life. And only through the process of this writing did I get to enjoy realizing that, which maybe it comes out in the writing or not, but it was an emotional kind of special thing. The tree
Mm.
is now gone. My grandfather who planted it is now gone. And so that process was also, I think, therapeutic and kind of touching and moving for me as I was realizing it as the words spilled out onto the page.
One of the reasons that interaction between you and the Jeremy tree struck me so much is because, and I had never thought about this before I read this, but I don't think I've ever had an experience where a tree and I felt like we were having kind of the same experience of time, right? Like
Hmm.
we're both growing together,
Hmm.
and trees usually represent either a time span that is beyond what I will experience as a person, or they represent a beginning of time, right? Like a new tree is planted in my neighborhood and I get to watch it grow. I wonder, as you were reflecting on the Jeremy tree and your relationship to it, whether you thought about time at all and how time that you shared, how that informed who you were
Hmm.
and who the Jeremy tree was to you. I keep talking about the tree as though it's a person, but I tend to anthropomorphize trees.
I guess it kind of is. um, I wish I could remember who this quote comes from, but it does pop up into my mind often in this process that, the greatest contribution we can give to society is planting trees under which its shade we will never be able to enjoy, that it's a gift to the future. And perhaps that's part of that deep connection we have to trees, which is fairly universal in this research. I was learning about communities all over the world and their relationship with trees. And, you know, going into the sequoias, I met with people who've given their entire lives to understanding trees, these biologists with the Ancient Forest Society who live, eat, sleep, breathe. They know everything about trees. And you look at their scientific connection and go, okay, that's your career, that's your knowledge base. But to be there in the woods with them, climbing the trees, sitting on the branches, listening to them talk about it beyond a university lecture, you see that passionate, deep, soulful connection they have, and you just want to be a part of it. You want to
Mm.
know these things that are so familiar to us that I want to know more about them. I want to know how to protect them. And the ones that are vulnerable, I want to be involved in not only prolonging their life, but letting others know how special they are.
Support comes from Seattle Restored, revitalizing Seattle neighborhoods with creativity and commerce. Over 95 vacant storefronts have been transformed into vibrant pop-up shops, window art installations, and artist residences. Explore current and past locations at seattlerestored.org.
Hey, I'm Ton Vin, host of the Seattle Eats podcast. I want you to join me, Kenshi Lopez Alt, and Rachel Bell for a special live taping of the show. We'll share insider tips, foodie secrets, and answers to your biggest dining questions. Join us Monday, November 10th at 7:30 p.m. at Town Hall Seattle. Find out more and get tickets at kuow.org/events.
KUOW live events are sponsored by Finney Ridge Painting.
You mentioned earlier that your first book is about climbing mountains. You've been a climber for a long time. What was it like climbing a sequoia?
Uh, it was different, partially because the first round of volunteering, you show up and the ropes are already rigged because they have rigged them before you get there. And as a climber, you want to know what you're attached to and how it's attached and what's up there because the ropes they disappear into the canopy 250 feet above you. So it just turns into this fishing line. You can't see where it goes into, eternity. And so you show up to climb these ropes and they're floating out away from the tree 15, 20 feet. So immediately, as soon as you start ascending them, you're exposed. Like
Wow.
your feet aren't kicking off the trunk, you're just out in space. So I had to rely on just the trust of the system. Like, okay, these guys are professionals. I'm sure everything's fine. But honestly, after 100 feet of ascending these ropes, you still aren't touching anything. You're still out in space. It starts to be unnerving because it's just a single rope. There's no backup. And I felt it. I felt the lump in my throat. I'm like, I'm a climber. I'll be just fine. And then, I talk about it in the book. I have a radio and I radio down to my spotter, this guy named Dibs. Hey, Dibs, what am I supposed to do when I get to these big first limbs? And he radios back, I don't know. I just started this 7 days ago. And so my spotter down below was as less experienced as I was. So it was kind of funny, but then it turned into something that felt more natural, where you'd be ascending the rope a little bit, but you'd be using your body to navigate over these massive limbs. And the sequoia limbs are as big as the trees that we know generally. I mean, a limb goes
Right.
out straight horizontal and it's 3 feet thick. So it's not what we know as a limb in your neighborhood tree. It's just a wild space up there.
What was time like up there? I feel like it had to have been a different experience.
It was. Once you're in the canopy, you're detached. Like the only communication is through our radios. And because everyone's taking samples and working up there, you can look through your binoculars and see other people at your same height taking samples. And the only rush to get down is to take those samples down to a cooler where they are preparing for testing and all these things. But it feels silly to go back down. I mean, it's so much effort to get up there and all the rigging. And it's also a place that no one else goes to climb a mature sequoia is a treat. It is a honor because it's illegal otherwise. You don't
Mm-hmm.
just casually go out for a Saturday activity and go find a giant sequoia grove and let's go climb. Like it's only with permission. So it feels very special and sacred and you don't want it to be over. So there is a moment in the book where I just pause and watch the sunrise because we're doing 4 a.m. samples. And this last summer, we went back and volunteered again. And you know how it is with volunteering, the more you do it, the more responsibility you're given. So going back the second time, I have new tests that I'm allowed to take and new responsibility and ownership. And I had the opportunity to sit up there on the one of the most memorable sunrises of my life, sitting at the top of this beautiful, beautiful giant sequoia.
Mm. Well, Jeremy, I wanted to talk to you about the event you're doing here in Seattle on the 27th. It's described as a live storytelling experience, and there will be a mobile art installation happening at the same time. I think we can probably both acknowledge that sometimes leaving your house and showing up at an event is not the easiest thing in the world to do. What do you think I would miss if I didn't come to this?
I think we'd miss high-fiving in the lobby.
Ah, that's true.
We've purposely left it a little bit mysterious so that there's all sorts of surprises, but
Fair.
it's a start to finish story in which I invite you into both my journals, which they're a 5 by 7 inch accordion. So something you can hold in your hand, but when you open it, it unravels into these 15-foot wide singular pieces. And so that aesthetically is played into this book tour where I build a life-size example of one of my journals. But the final page of Eventually a Sequoia is this anchoring poem for me that is called Gather. And it talks about the benefits of gathering and the benefits of connecting. And the final line of the poem is parts of me I thought were dead when gathered still I grow. And that's really the energy behind this tour is gathering people together for something real, for
Mm.
something that's not media driven, it is not AI, it is not something we're experiencing through devices, but we're sitting elbow to elbow in these small, intimate spaces, and in some ways being vulnerable, both myself and in the audience, as I invite you to reflect on your own path and your own life. And so I've been really encouraged. I'm on my fifth show here on the tour of how receptive people are and how much they need, and they're desperate for these moments without knowing it. And I think the further down the road we go, we're going to need that live music, live experiences, gathering with like-minded people, to encourage us forward in our own paths. So, I recognize inviting your friends to a book event is like, what, a book performance? What is it? What are you inviting me to? So I just encourage people, go have an early dinner, come show up early, sit down, ground yourself, and turn your phone on silent, and let's gather.
Jeremy, I've had such a nice time talking with you. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Jeremy Collins is an artist and graphic memoirist. His latest book is called Eventually A Sequoia: Stories of Adventures and the Wisdom of Giants. And you can gather to be part of his book event on Monday, October 27th at the Mountaineers Program Center in Seattle. We'll have a link to reserve your place at the event in our show notes. Meet Me Here is produced by KUOW, a proud member of the NPR network. It's hosted by me, Katie Campbell, and Dyer Oxley. It's produced by Kyle Norris, Brandy Fullwood, and Matt Martin. Your financial support makes podcasts like Meet Me Here possible. Help us make all the local shows you rely on at kuow.org/meet. I'm Jeannie Yandel. See you soon.
"29 years ago, the first photograph of a jaguar was taken crossing from Mexico into Arizona. Today, there is something very different happening on the border. I'm Chris Morgan. Join me on The Wild as we follow the biggest cats in North America as they expand their range from Mexico into the United States, and what might be getting in the way, including a steel border wall that now snakes across the mountains between the two. Listen to The Wild with Chris Morgan on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.